And so thank you all for joining us online. I really appreciate your participation in this. This is actually kind of our first actual faculty presentation. So we did have an ITRC workshop yesterday, but this is the first opportunity for us to join with faculty and kind of get the faculty perspective on some really important stuff. So it is my pleasure to introduce John Burnham, who served as a lecturer at Idaho State University for the past 5 years. He previously dedicated 27 years to working as a clinician with the Department of Juvenile Corrections, while also practicing part-time as a mental health counselor. John earned his bachelor's degree from Idaho State and his master's degree from Northwest Nazarene University. He is passionate about teaching and enjoys sharing his professional experiences to inspire others to strengthen their communities through education. John and his wife are the owners of a counseling center where they are committed to serving their community. Outside of his professional work, John enjoys spending time with his family, especially his grandson, fishing, vacationing, all sports, and all things music. So please join me in welcoming John. John, I'll turn the floor over to you.
All right, thank you so very much. Good to be with everybody. I hope that this goes well and is what people were hoping for. Here's my hopeful outcomes for everybody today. One, to be able to define trauma and help people understand a little bit about what trauma is. To then take that to understand how trauma affects the classroom. So we know some general things that trauma does, but then let's kind of move that into what that looks like in the classroom. Here's probably my biggest hope that comes out of this, is that it just kind of gives a new perspective of thinking about some of the especially behaviors or challenges that we face in the classroom with individuals who have experienced trauma, and then to provide a few practical tools that we might start to implement as far as a university or an individual within our classrooms. I've been teaching courses around trauma in the social work department. That's where I'm currently located, as far as treating trauma and working with individuals who present in a clinical presentation with trauma. And so I want to expand that to looking at it in the education classroom. So that's where my background for this comes from. So the first question then is, what is trauma? SAMHSA probably gives us the best definition of trauma that I've found. Their definition, and the definition that I, again, enjoy, is this: individual trauma can result from an event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on an individual's functioning, both mentally, physically, socially, emotionally, or spiritually. Now, there's a lot in that we can unpack. So one of the things that we talk about what trauma is that trauma can be experienced. So somebody can have an experience that is traumatic that they actually go through. Trauma can also be something that's witnessed. So we can watch an event happen. Doesn't necessarily need to happen to us, but we can watch something happen, and that can be traumatic. Trauma can also be something that feels very threatening to us, that overwhelms our senses, and that we have this impending threat that's going to happen. It can also be something that we hear about, especially if it's somebody that we care about or somebody that is impactful in our life. Hearing about a trauma to somebody else can cause us trauma as well. In the helping professions and in education, as we hear about other people's traumas, sometimes we can become traumatized ourselves. We call that secondary trauma. And so just hearing about trauma can have effects on us as individuals as well. And so all of those things can be traumatic or result in a traumatic experience. Trauma can be temporary. So it can be something that lasts for a short period of time. And it can be anywhere from days to weeks to months. Or trauma can be also have prolonged reactions that go on indefinitely. And so we can be something that we can look at in kind of a short term and be able to work through and manage. But while we're in that temporary situation, the trauma experience is affecting us dramatically. Or it's just something that maybe we have to struggle and manage our whole lifetime. Trauma can be a single event, so we call that big T or big trauma. So a big event might be that we're in a big car accident. It might be that a natural disaster happens. Or it can be what we call a little t, or an accumulation of events. So that would be a lot of things that are happening over a period of time, and those little things happening over and over and over and over again add up to be a big T, a big trauma. So accumulation of events can also be very traumatic. So if somebody is living in a home where domestic violence is occurring, so the violence is between mom and dad. So the child isn't even experiencing it, but they are there while it's happening, witnessing, they're seeing it happen, and that happens day after day after day after day for a period of time. That then becomes a major trauma in that individual's life. So that would be an example of an accumulation of events. So trauma can be a single time, can also be added up over time. One of the things that we know is that trauma can be experienced at different levels. So trauma can happen at the individual level. So it can happen to a person. There's also this idea of group trauma, so becoming part of a group and things happening within the group. So educators could be a group where if some major things happened, that it would be very traumatic. We live in a day and age where there's a lot of uncertainty. I know right now there's a lot of uncertainty about higher education and what's going to happen. So educators as a group, like all of the faculty at ISU, could be considered a group where if decisions are made, we know that there's pending decisions, that could actually cause some trauma as a group. Trauma can happen at the community level. So like if a community had a natural event, a natural disaster, say for instance, several years the Teton flood happened and all of like Rexburg was pretty much kind of wiped out. So as a community, that traumatic experience exists and is part of now that history and the part of what happened to the people who lived in that community at the time. And there's also this idea of generational trauma. So as certain generations have experienced traumatic experiences, they pass on the values and experiences and things to their children, who then assimilate their beliefs and values and the trauma that's related to those experiences down to the next generation. And that can go on also. There have been atrocities that have happened to groups of people throughout history, and those can leave lasting imprints of trauma, even though they didn't experience them individually, but have heard about them and have been passed on to them. So generational trauma is that idea or that experience. And so trauma can happen lots of different ways, lots of different levels, in lots of different experiences. One of the other things that's very interesting about trauma is that it's very dependent on the individual that experiences the event. Essentially what this means is that one person can experience, two people can experience the same event, and one person can come out of that with a trauma event. And another person can come out of that and just think, oh, that was kind of bad or that was difficult, and move on from it and not have that trauma response. And so trauma is very individual as well. What we think might be traumatic, some other people might just think is part of normal life and not a big deal. We may think that, oh, that's not a big deal, get over it. Well, for that individual, that may be a big deal and something they just can't get over. And so our perceptions about what is traumatic, we need to be careful about, because everybody experiences things different. And people have different experiences in their life and different coping mechanisms and different values that interpret the event through those lenses that influence whether it's traumatic or not. People have different abilities to cope with stress and challenges. If somebody doesn't have good coping, different good abilities that have been built in, then when traumatic events happen, they don't have the capacity and it becomes a traumatic event. So individuals can experience things and have different reactions to it. And so trauma is very individual. That's an important thing to remember. One of the things that I think is kind of interesting is the historical lens or the historical focus on trauma, and really how new the idea and recognition of trauma is. I think this is an important thing as we look at where we're at with it and where we need to go with this idea of trauma in the classroom. So historically, the focus of trauma was on war. The end of World War II, generally, we started to recognize that as soldiers are coming home, that they were experiencing some issues. The idea of shell shock was introduced, but it stayed very much specific to war and those people who experienced war. The Vietnam War had a little bit too, but it was very much stayed within this idea of war and returning veterans. It wasn't until 1995 when Kaiser Permanente started to recognize that there was a lot of issues with health and insurance things that were coming through that was costing them a lot of money. They're getting a lot of these repeat people coming in, and so they decided to do a little bit of a kind of investigative study, and ended up being called the Adverse Childhood Experience Study. And they followed and did surveys with thousands of people in California, is where this started. And one of the things that they started to recognize is that people who had significant medical issues had significant histories of trauma. And so they were able to, through this ACE study, and produce sort of an outcome algorithm that said that if you have one adverse childhood experience, that put you at risk for additional problems, whether that was health-wise, whether that was chronic diseases or social problems. As they found that a person with 4 ACEs or 4 experiences had a significant increase in chronic disease, mental health, and social problems, and started to make some correlations and connections with trauma, or these adverse childhood experiences, trauma that happened in childhood that resulted in significant, in this case, health issues, but expanded to looking at mental health and additional social problems. And that was really the first study that got national attention, that really got people looking at, okay, well, if this is having like huge adverse effects on adults in their health and how they're functioning, we probably need to take a look at this in a broader sense. And researchers then began additional research, and the field of trauma from then really has exploded. In 2014, SAMHSA created their trauma-informed practice manual to start to get this message out about how to work better with individuals who have trauma and substance abuse and mental health. 2015 was the introduction of trauma into the education field. By about 2020, it was starting to become a little bit more integrated. First, the focus was on children, so that K through 12 was the original focus and kind of initial push to recognize trauma, and then later into adult and secondary education. So if you look at those timelines, 2020 was like 6 years ago. That's not very long ago, from a time frame wise, when trauma has been recognized and begin to be studied and programmed and ideas put into practice in different settings, whether that's in the mental health setting, in the education setting, in the health setting, in all settings. And so we're still in the beginning efforts of getting the idea of trauma-informed care, of understanding the impacts of trauma on individuals in different settings, so in the beginning stages of that. And so really my presentation is a lot just to bring this to people's awareness that this is an issue, but something that is important, something that we need to be aware of, and for institutions and agencies and groups of people to grapple with and say, on a bigger scale, what are we going to do about trauma and its impacts? So we can look at this at an individual level, so me as an individual teacher in my classroom, but really the trauma-informed care is aimed also at looking at the bigger picture and what can groups and organizations do to integrate this fully into systems. So into the whole system of ISU would eventually be the goal. The prevalence of trauma. So one of the things that we know at this point is that roughly about 70% of people worldwide will experience at least one traumatic event in their lifetime. That's a pretty large number statistically, 70%. 30.5% will experience 4 or more traumas in their lifetime. So about a third of people will experience at least 4. Now, if we go back to the ACEs study, 4 or more was their cutoff that really signified significant later outcomes of difficulties, both health and with social problems and mental health. So about a third of people reach that level of experience with trauma. As far as the school, 66% of first-year students will have experienced a traumatic event. So incoming freshmen in their freshman year, more than half of them will have a traumatic event occur in their life. Again, that's pretty significant. More than half of our students will have some kind of trauma experience at first year of school. College students experience on average 6 potential trauma events over their 4 years of study. So that's, again, more than that 4, leading to those difficult outcomes. Women and those who have lower socioeconomic status even have higher rates than that. 26% of young adults live with mental illness. So about a fourth of our student population have some kind of diagnosable mental illness. And 75% of all mental illness manifests itself by age 25. So in our psychology and our clinical programs, we can show and we can demonstrate that period between about 17 and 25 is when most major mental illness is going to really present itself. Schizophrenia, things that leading up to that, but by age 25 is when the most mental health is going to present itself, which is right smack in that time when students are in college. And so they may be experiencing mental illness or some of the challenges really for the first time, or it may be coming to a head as building up through adolescence during their time here in college. So that's significant as well. So this time period we're looking at is pretty significant when it comes to people experiencing or people manifesting things that are going to add towards traumatic experiences. So there's this thing called trauma triggers. So a trauma trigger would be something that is connected back to or reminds us of a previous trauma experience. So if a student is traumatized sometime in their life before coming to college, then these trauma triggers are things that remind them back to or connect back to those previous trauma events. And that could be, again, last week when the trauma happened and the trauma trigger is happening this week, or it could be from years ago when they experienced a trauma, maybe in their early childhood to now. So the time frame doesn't matter. The fact that there's these triggers that bring back those experiences, recreate this trauma experience or this trauma response to trauma. Trauma can happen through any of our senses. So things that we hear, things that we touch, things that we smell, things that we taste, things that we see, anything can be related to trauma triggers. So the way a person talks, their cadence, their tone of voice can be a trauma trigger. Something that they touch, piece of clothing, the texture of a book, the texture of the carpet, any of those things can be trauma triggers. Smells can be trauma triggers. I think this is actually pretty interesting that like maybe a person's perfume or cologne might be a trauma trigger related back to a person who was involved in the creation of a trauma event. The smell of the classroom, the smell of a laboratory, anything like that can be trauma triggers back to events. Taste, seeing that we see. So seemingly people's reactions to trauma, and when things happen, we're going, I don't know why nobody said anything, nobody did anything, yet here's this kind of strained response. It can be from something as simple as unaware of something as, like the perfume or the cologne that we're wearing that we just normally do in our day-to-day activities. So becoming aware that lots of things can be triggers is important. Any current situation that involves any aspect of a past trauma can be a trauma trigger. So as I was thinking about this presentation, I was thinking about related to education especially. So if a student grew up in a home where the punishment was to write sentences, that was a pretty common practice at some point. So you're going to practice writing sentences until I tell you you're done, or for a certain period of time, or until you do 100 of them. And then they get to school and they say, okay, we're going to practice our grammar and we're going to dissect these. And so you're going to practice writing these sentences and go, that experience of having to write sentences is connected now to a traumatic event for them of being kind of punished in a way using that. And so something as simple as asking them to do a project that would normally be a part of what we do can actually be a trigger back to a prior experience. Somebody in the classroom can be told, oh, you're stupid, you don't know how to read. And they just kind of hear that message over and over and over again, not necessarily intentionally, but I would hope that most teachers aren't as blunt as that, but they get this message that, oh, you're stupid, you can't read. And so then somehow they make their way through school, they get here, and they have this idea that I can't read. But then we ask for students to read off the board, can you read this paragraph to the class? And the thing that's going through their head is, I can't read. People are going to think I'm stupid. So then when it comes to doing that, they become super triggered and have a trauma reaction. So anything, again, there's so many examples and instances of situations that can mirror or have those connections back to past traumas that in the course of our day-to-day things we probably don't think about. But once we become aware of how these triggers can happen, now we have additional information that we can compare these against and recognize. And this is one of my major outcomes of this is hopefully just for people to recognize that ordinary things can be traumatic to people. And so when we have these reactions, it's not necessarily out of the blue. It's not out of nothing. It's not seemingly like wondering and so confusing. It's that putting it in the back of our mind that I know that about half of my students have potentially had trauma. And this could be a traumatic response. It doesn't always, it's not always a response, but it could be a response. When individuals have trauma, generally our fight, flight, freeze, fawn response kicks in. And with the fight, flight, freeze, fawn comes some general behaviors that we can be aware of. This is a super busy slide. I think all these slides will be available for people to continue. So you can come back to the slide and look at all the busyness of it. But if you look at some of the common behaviors, so in like the fight, we have bullying, intimidating. Here's one of the things that we might see in class a lot is criticizing. So your ideas are stupid. I can't believe that you think that way. So criticizing both the instructor and other students. Very controlling of kind of the way class goes or the narrative or how things are happening. So that'd be a fight response to trauma. A flight response, some of those common behaviors are to hypervigilance, being super aware of what's happening, avoidance, overreacting, so just that isolating, kind of keeping to themselves, non-participation, freeze, again, that super isolating, rumination, kind of being caught up in their own thoughts, not having a super difficult time focusing, concentrating on what's happening. They may have missed large portions of the conversation or the lesson that's being taught, and so they may ask a question that you already answered a long time ago, but they weren't paying attention because they were in a freeze mode. Fawn is an interesting response. Fawning means that I'm going to do kind of whatever it takes to make sure that I'm safe. So this is like a pretending kind of a place. And so things that I might do is I might be really involved in class, and I might try and be the best student ever so that nobody draws attention to the fact that I'm having problems or issues. And so it's like this almost over indulgence of whatever the situation is. So fawn, we see that as well. So in the classroom, some of the resulting behaviors that we see is a lack of participation. And so we see people who just struggle to speak up, struggle to give their voice in class. And most people, or a lot of people, have class participation connected to grades. Like that's a pretty typical expectation. And so if somebody has had an experience in the classroom previous that they were basically told to be quiet, not to participate, their input wasn't valued, maybe they struggled with attention deficit and their thoughts weren't really complete and people didn't give them the time of day to value their input. Lots of different reasons that somebody might not feel safe participating. And so safety is one of the major pieces that we're going to be looking at for in response to trauma. So lack of participation can be related to past trauma, which becomes problematic when we assign grades to participation. So somebody might not be able to get their full points participation-wise because of trauma and it being a trauma-based response. That can be problematic. Another place this can show up is when we do group projects. They may be okay doing something solo, doing their own work, but when we put them in a group and say, now you have to navigate the group process, that can be very traumatic if they've integrated or if they've had experiences with other people in which they have trusting difficulty working with other people. Now we say, you're going to be assigned to a group, you need to do this group task. So they may really struggle with group because of the difficulties trusting, the difficulties interacting. We might find students staring off into space. That's a pretty typical response in the classroom. There can be so many reasons for people to not be engaged in class. Maybe they're bored. Maybe they didn't get as much sleep. Maybe they're preoccupied. They're hungry. There's so many reasons. But one of the reasons that people have a hard time focusing in class, difficulty concentrating, is related to trauma, because they're cued, they're triggered in a traumatic way, and so their mind now is focused back on that trauma as opposed to whatever's happening in front of them. Now we know that when people are in that frame of mind, when they're not paying attention, they're not focusing, they're missing large chunks of information that's going to impact their education, their learning, their grades, their ability to take tests, to recall information. It's going to impact their grades. Leaving class early can be one of those things that we see. Again, lots of reasons that people leave class early. Maybe they have other appointments, maybe the other thing is leaving class frequently. So if people are coming and going, they need like several breaks during the class period. And we're thinking, this is very distracting, this is very inconvenient, they're not really paying attention to class, they're not invested. So leaving class frequently can be related to trauma. And the fact that maybe they're being triggered, they need to leave so that they can regulate, and then they come back, they're okay for a while, maybe they need to leave again, or they seem to do that in multiple classes. So again, can be related trauma. Doesn't always trauma, but it can be. Being late to class or frequent absences, same thing. Can be related to those trauma experiences. Student who's always challenging, who's always arguing, who's criticizing, again, that can be a trauma response of that need to be in control and the need to control things. And so we have students who do that don't have trauma, but we recognize that also can be a part of trauma. So we need to try and figure out the difference between what is happening. Frequent late assignments is another thing we might see in results to this. If trauma is currently going on in their environment, it's really, really difficult to do your homework. If things are not safe where you're living, it's very difficult. And so they might have late assignments, missing assignments, because things are not good in their environment. Lots of times, school is the safest place for students. It's predictable. Generally, the teachers and those people are interested in their learning, interested in their safety. They get food. Sometimes school is the safest place. And so they enjoy being here, but when you go outside the classroom, then things totally fall apart because of the environment, because of the insecurities, because of the things that are happening out there. So that can be part of this picture. The lack of communication, typically related to, so if we reach out and people don't reciprocate that can be related to trauma. If they just have late assignments and they don't give you any explanation. Again, that lack of communication lots of times can be a tip that there's something going on that's related to trauma. Poor boundaries can also be a result of trauma. So the oversharing, like, okay, we don't need to know about all the things that happen during your day, during your life, people sometimes will overshare. That's sort of that fawning part, or they'll monopolize. They'll just go on and on and on and on and on. as a way of keeping things safe and keeping things predictable. Falling asleep in class, one of the difficulties with trauma is difficulty sleeping. And so oftentimes students might fall asleep in class because they're just not sleeping well related to trauma. Also needing to stay energized in class can be kind of one of those tip-offs. So they really want to be in class, but they're having a difficulty staying engaged, concentrating, staying awake. So sometimes you'll have that student who has like 3 energy drinks in front of them in class as a way of coping, of trying to stay engaged, trying to stay awake, trying to stay in the moment, because they're having difficulties in other areas. So those would be some of the behaviors that we might see in the classroom, kind of related to this fight, flight, freeze, fawn response. So that's a little bit a little bit about trauma, what trauma behaviors might be, etc. So this next part talks about what is trauma-informed care. So trauma-informed care is this. It's a strength-based framework for service delivery that recognizes, understands, and responds to the impact of trauma on individuals. So a framework has to do with strength-based that recognizes, understands, responds to trauma. So we're going to respond differently. Trauma-informed care integrates knowledge about trauma into policies and procedures to create a supportive environment for both the student and the staff. So one of the things that I really like about the idea of trauma-informed care is that it's going to help students, but it's also going to help us. It's going to make life better for me and for you and for people around us. So it helps both students and the staff. Part of this has to do, again, with our policies and procedures. What are the structures around that allow for a different way of responding to trauma that helps out those who have trauma? I mentioned this can happen at the individual level. So in your classroom, as you're setting up, what are your policies and procedures? And do they allow for and take into account for trauma? This can happen also at a bigger level, organizational level, like at the whole institution. This I think is a really good definition. So trauma-informed care is not a specific intervention. So it's not necessarily like a specific do this kind of intervention or tool, but it's an organizational and cultural change that applies to all interactions and environments from the clinical setting to social service. So trauma-informed care can be in any setting. Again, we teach it in the clinical setting. We're talking now about in the social service setting of education. It addresses both the immediate needs of trauma survivors and the potential for secondary trauma among staff by focusing on safety and empowerment. Trauma-informed care helps survivors rebuild a sense of control and reduces the likelihood of recidivation or re-victimization. This is also another way of thinking about that same definition. So trauma-informed care is an organizational change process that requires all individuals, practices, and protocols and environments to engage in universal precautions for trauma. So I like this analogy. Similar to how healthcare professionals put on gloves when needing to touch patients as a universal precaution for pathogens, being trauma-informed requires putting on metaphorical gloves by changing interactions, policies, and environments to prevent the possibility of re-traumatization. So similar to universal precautions, it's a way of thinking about changing our ideas, changing our policies, changing the environment to account for trauma. So one of the things it does is it shifts our focus from what's wrong with you to what's happening to you or what happened to you. And this promotes safety, empowerment, and healing, along with not re-traumatizing or causing those triggers to happen. So this is like, if there's one thing that you would take away regarding trauma-informed care, this is it. It's called the 4 R's. And the 4 R's is that, one, we realize the widespread impact of trauma and understand its potential paths to recovery. So we have to realize that it's here, that it does things. Number 2, recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma and that there's involvement systems. 3, respond. So respond by fully integrating this knowledge into our policies, procedures, and practices. And then the 4th R, resist. So resist to re-traumatizing. And we do things differently in a way that respects and responds and doesn't cause trauma. What trauma-informed care or trauma-informed pedagogy is not? It's not therapeutic. It's not a clinical intervention. You don't have to do any intervention. You have to do anything clinical. It doesn't require you to know about your students' paths. It's that universal approach, a universal design that can be applied to anything. It's not about trauma. It's not you about teaching trauma. It's not about teaching. It's more about you integrating these into your way of teaching. It doesn't require you to do more or to go outside of your role. Again, it's more of that approach and how you design and how you manage your classroom. So it's within what we normally do. It's just a different way of thinking about it. It doesn't only benefit students, but it helps everybody. It's going to help you as a teacher. It's going to help actually the rest of your students who don't have trauma. And it doesn't take away the rigor and high expectations of education. I think that's an important also concept in regards to education. It doesn't say we need to lower the bar. It doesn't say we need to not expect people to reach certain expectations. But it says that we need to be responsive to their experience in doing that. So we don't make it easier. We just help them to reach the expectation by recognizing the barrier, the challenge, the trauma that's involved in doing so. So when it comes to the classroom, we have this trauma-informed care in the classroom. It's also known as trauma-informed pedagogy. So these are some principles that fall under trauma-informed pedagogy. So one of the things that we're going to be looking at is physical, emotional, social, and academic safety. So efforts are made to create an atmosphere that's respectful of the need for safety, respect, and acceptance in both individuals and group interactions, including feeling safe to make and learn from mistakes. That's a big piece of trauma that's can be triggering, is that idea of making mistakes. So creating a physical, so our classroom, physical space, emotional, social, and academic safety. 2, trustworthiness and transparency. So trust and transparency are enhanced by making expectations clear, ensuring consistency, both in practice and maintaining appropriate boundaries while minimizing disappointment. Making things transparent, very known, surprises, do difficult things, create difficult things when people are traumatized. So them having as much knowledge, as much awareness of things that are upcoming, as much predictability, and as much control is important principle of trauma-informed care, and creating a trusting environment. Number 3, supporting connection. Individuals and groups are connected with appropriate peer and professional resources to help them succeed academically, personally, and professionally. So you don't have to do it, but being able to connect individuals and know where those supports are is important. ISU has some really good things in place to help with this. ISU has a great counseling center. They do amazing work. They're overworked, and they have lots of students that they're trying to serve, but we do have a really good counseling center. We have some processes in place to identify students who are struggling. Our Navigate, it's called the Navigate program, looks at those time periods and says, are there students who are falling behind or are struggling academically, and what supports do we need to make aware, can we put in place to support them? And that might be educationally, or that might be in more of a personal counseling of being aware of what's going on situation. So we are making some efforts in that direction, which is exciting. Number 4, collaboration and mutuality. So opportunities exist to provide input, share power, and make decisions. Individuals and groups act as allies rather than adversaries to reach common goals. As much as we can involve our students in decision making, what's going to happen in the classroom, how are we going to go about doing things, as much power as we can give to them, as much input as we can receive from them, that makes them part of this process and feels like they're not having that power taken from them, which is one of the major things of trauma, is that sense of loss of power. And so if we can give as much back to them, that's going to mitigate some of that trauma response. Number 5 is empowerment, voice, and choice. So individuals and groups are empowered to make choices and develop confidence and competencies. So again, allowing some flexibility and allowing them to have some choices helps with that trauma response. Number 6 is social justice. Individuals and groups strive to be aware of and responsive to forms of privilege and oppression in order to respect one another's diverse experience and identities. This is really important. Different people have different experiences and are more prone to trauma. And so we need to be aware of that and responsive to that. Number 7, resilience, growth, and change. So strength and resilience are emphasized over deficits and pathology. Feedback is provided to convey optimism and to facilitate growth and change. So as we're giving feedback, we want to be in that positive framework, giving them hope, giving them that idea that they can overcome, that they can achieve the goals that they want. So here are just some small tools, some ideas, some things. And there's lots more than this. These are just the ones that are here. And probably another time, another person could actually focus a lot on these. So as far as the physical, emotional, social, academic safety, that principle, one of the things we can do is to integrate mistakes into course activities in a way that explicitly values them and uses them to value further learning. We can offer low-risk, repeatable opportunities to demonstrate knowledge. I like that idea of repeatable opportunities. Ensure that elements of graded course assignments are ones they've already experienced within the course, so they know what to expect when it comes to grading. Minimize surprises, such as cold calling. Trustworthiness and transparency. Share the purpose of activities and assignments. Share an agenda, your class outline, your weekly overview. Use the transparency in teaching, learning framework, assignments. Give clear instructions, structure for our discussion. Another help is even if that goes more again. So be clear in our instructions, even though it seems pretty simple, pretty obvious to us. Have predictable deadlines that students are aware of as early as possible. An important connection. Refer students who mention basic needs or concerns, mental health challenges, disabilities to relevant units. Ideally with a warm handoff, meaning we're going to facilitate that process. Normalize help seeking. This one I think is so important. Normalize that help seeking and accessing resources is a smart strategy to success. So really emphasizing that it's okay that lots of people do this, that they're not strange, they're not broken, they're not because they need to access resources. So around that stigma. Collaboration and mutuality. So create a class agreement or a class compact that underscores beliefs and behaviors that might support class community and have students customize it together. It's actually a great tool to use at the beginning of class. So as you talk about how the class is going to go, just have them start to create some of the rules and expectations and norms of the class. So then they have an opportunity again to participate, to be part of that process, as opposed to me just dictating what that is. I say to make grading curves, voice and choice, offer different options for participation, including solo or group work, providing different options, encourage students to do what they need physically to support learning. So if they need to take breaks, that's okay. Normalize the variety of participation and co-working behavior as positive contributions. So when they do go into cooperative or participation work, they're going to give different levels or different impact at different parts of their contribution. So normalize that a variety of ways of doing things count as that contribution. Design choice into assignments and in-class activities. That piece of social justice, recognize that generational trauma is a real thing that exists, real. And then the last one, as far as resilience and growth, be clear verbally and in action that you know all your students can succeed in your class. That growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. Invite students to reflect on their own growth and to set their own goals for additional growth. And share feedback that's oriented to both student goals and towards what is needed to reach the next stage, the next level of skills, knowledge the student might aim for. So my final takeaway, trauma can impact anyone. Hopefully this gets that point across. Trauma can impact learning, both inside and outside the classroom. Just that recognition changes the way we do things, which is that third point, that recognizing this helps us to respond to the challenge of trauma in a different way. Our response can be in a different way, and that we can make sense of behaviors that seem irrational or don't make sense to help students be successful. And that's all. Here's some of the resources that I use in putting this together. So if you're interested in additional learning on this, University of Georgia Center for Teaching and Learning, Trauma-Informed Teaching, Trauma-Informed Pedagogy, Teaching Support and Innovative from the University of Oregon were good resources that I pulled from. And that is all.
Thank you, John. Do we have any, I do have one online question, but I'll turn it over to you folks on Zoom. Does anybody have any questions for John? Randa, go ahead.
See class.
Oh, she's clapping. Okay, I don't have my glasses on. I thought you were raising your hand. Thanks, Randa. We do have one comment. I'll share this with you, John. So one comment was, I have heard an alternative description of fawn because of the idea that one is not going overboard to please their captor or attacker, but simply appease them. The victim is only trying to get to a level of preventing their own harm. What have you heard of this description, and which do you think is a clearer description?
I have heard of that, yes, and I would say that both are accurate. One is to over appease and one is to appease to the level of, until I can escape. So like, and we see, this comes out of nature. So when an animal is being attacked, one of the things it'll do is pretend that it's dead or whatever. So that's fawning. So let me pretend that I'm in this situation until you leave, and then I can get up and escape. So yes, it can be both.
Both accurate. Okay. All right. Just double check, make sure we don't have any additional ones. Okay, last chance. Anybody have a question or comment for John? All right, well, thank you all for attending, and thank you, John. That was really very informative for me. And so I really appreciate your presentation. And thank you all. We will probably be sending you all some surveys, just kind of a standard process that we have in place for all of our presentations. So I will get those out to you pretty soon. Thank you all. And
Thank
have a
you.
good rest of your day. Yeah, that was.